Hello and welcome to BCM241 Media Ethnographies. This week we're talking about digital ethnography, and I'm experimenting with a different format and trying a live to camera recording so that you get my floating head down here. So if I look over here, it's to check what you can see on the screen. This is all pretty new for me, so bear with me. So there may be some technical troubles and some cuts along the way as I edit after this, but I'm trying to experiment with different formats and different content presentation styles. So, and looking forward to getting your feedback about that. So leave a comment down below. Okay, so there's lots to get on with this week, and let's get stuck into it. All right, firstly, let's think about what the digital means. What does the word actually mean? The digital is dialogical. That means it involves a communication exchange. That digital information is always networked. It's always speaking to multiple connections. The digital implies one to many, and in fact, really many to many. And so when we're talking about digital information, digital ethnographies, we're really always implying networked connections. What's interesting about the digital is that it is not static. And many people think of the digital as being kind of intangible and virtual, but at the core, the digital, in the way we know it at least, is electronic, and it is therefore not static. It is not fixed. It is a signal. It is always in motion. There's an old terminology that we used to refer to software in operation as running, and that's a really good way of thinking about the digital. It is always in movement. The digital is therefore always connected by processes to mechanical interpretation. Right? The machine is actively interpreting the binary code of digital information and converting that into human readable content via visuals or text or whatever. So the digital is a process. It is in motion, it is static, and it is always being interpreted by machines for human interpretation. So there's multiple levels of interpretation that's always implicated in the digital. What we also know about the digital is that it is not persistent. It is malleable, it is changeable, and it is easy to overwrite. Now that on the surface seems pretty straightforward, but actually en masse, the digital can get quite complicated, and it can be quite a complex means of deleting individual bits of information in a digital resource or a digital network or a digital library. I mean, yes, of course, you can always set off an EMP and wipe everything, but to actually go into a system and to delete individual bits of information is quite difficult. So the notion of persistence when it comes to the digital is quite complex. So, digital ethnography seeks to explore the consequences of these conditions of the digital. Digital ethnography seeks out and describes the cultures that are made possible or altered by the presence of digital technologies and practices. Remember, it's not just the thing itself, it's the cultural layer and the sociological layer of practices, organizations, institutions, communities, and networks, so on, that are brought into being or changed by the digital. And that's what digital ethnography is interested in. Digital ethnography discloses, it investigates the experience of reality as it is transformed or mediated by the digital through both empirical observation and the application of theory to the results of that observation in order to come up with an explanation. So some important texts that there'll be examples from these in the readings on the Moodle page this week. this lovely book by Anna Pertiera, Media Anthropology for the Digital Age, and this really useful text, the Routledge Companion to Digital Ethnography, edited by Larissa Hajorth and others. And these are two really good resources for digital ethnography. And they're examples of how communication and media scholars have embraced anthropological theories and methods of ethnography to make sense of cultural formations occurring as participants have both adopted new media technologies, adapted them to their purposes, and adapted to them. And we'll be talking about the differences between those processes as we go through. However, I like this point that Pertiera makes, is that media ethnography makes use of ethnographic methods to study media without claiming to be doing anthropological work. Anthropologists can get a bit uppity if you are suggesting that you are doing anthropology without having that specific training. So what we're doing is we're appropriating the methods of ethnography as they have been developed out of anthropology for our own purposes. And those purposes for you are in order to, we're attempting in this course to make relevant to your future careers and jobs in the creative industries. So thinking about how digital ethnography is useful to you beyond simply doing research for a uni project. So in the next two parts of this lecture, I'm going to be drawing heavily on this book by Sarah Pink and others. And you can see all the names there. This is the book, Digital Ethnography, Principles and Practice, and I'll be putting the first chapter on the Moodle page for you to have a read. I really like this book. 2016, which means it's getting quite dated now. One thing about digital ethnography is that it moves at a tremendous pace, but it's still really relevant and can help you think about your media ethnography projects in a number of different ways and how you might be able to hone your data collection and think about the ways in which you can understand that data and those observations through different analytical frameworks and theoretical paradigms, which I will touch on in this lecture today. So in the book, Pink et al. Describe a set of principles for thinking about digital ethnographic research. And I'm going to kind of summarize that before we get into the specifics of the categories of digital ethnography that they propose. So the first idea is multiplicity, and I like this. This is very much what I was talking to you before about the definition of digital. Digital ethnographic research is always unique to the research question and the challenges to which it's responding. I really like this because this says that regardless of the methods for collecting data, regardless of the analytical framework that you have or the theoretical paradigm that you're employing, what's really important is the central research question. Everything else comes after that. You have to figure out what you are trying to answer, what you are trying to find out, and that guides everything. And so there is no one set static, fixed method for doing, or methodology for doing digital ethnography. And an example of this would be researching social media. So if we were to research social media use in Australia, right, which might imply Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, that would be a very different research question with very different methods and very different analytical paradigms than a similar study researching social media use in China, right? Which
I don't understand. We are very
thanks, Siri. I appreciate your input, but you're going to have to be quiet. Okay. Sorry. Wasn't expecting that. So it threw me a little. Where was I? So yes, researching social media in China, which would not only mean different platforms and different access to that platforms and different technologies on the platforms that you are accessing, accessing, but an entirely different range of sociological and cultural understandings that would inform that the analysis going forward. So remember that digital ethnography is always guided by the research question and what you're trying to find out. Everything else follows that. This is a really important principle. The notion of decentering the technology, right? In a digital ethnography, the technology is not always the focus. We'll talk about cases in a minute where it is specifically the focus, but it's one among many elements that you have to consider. It's like I've been saying in your media ethnographies, we're not really interested in the text that you're examining. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in researching the experience of that text and figuring out what you can learn from that experience to help you make critical and interesting observations about it and gain new knowledge about it. So this involves decentering, decentering the technology. And I got a quote here from Pink. In order to understand how digital media are part of people's everyday worlds, we also need to understand the other aspects of their worlds and lives. In doing so, we might focus specifically on those domains of activity in which digital media are used rather than on the characteristics of the use of the media. We might focus specifically on the domains of activity. So it's not necessarily about the specific phone that you're using, but rather the whole range of context around which you are using that phone in that instance, at that time, in that location, in that way. Okay, an example. And a lot of these examples are actually going to be drawing from games, researching digital games, because that's my background, and I'm also teaching BCM241 game media industries. So there's a lot of overlap here for students who are doing both. Okay, so to understand the role of Fortnite in the lives of Australian children, I have two young children play Fortnite amongst other games. It's a competition at the moment between Fortnite and Minecraft. So how would we go about decentering the technology? Well, we could look at all the popular media reports and all the kind of dramatic news stories about claims to addiction and media violence, right? Maybe we could go in that direction, or we could put that away. And instead, we could look at the way in which these children are forming networks. We could look at the way in which they are talking to their friends, sharing memes, consuming YouTube videos, watching Twitch streamers, producing TikTok videos. Early on, there was a lot of replication of the Fortnite dance emotes. Or maybe if you had, kind of permission, you could go and observe how children talk about Fortnite in the playground, right? So this is what we mean by decentering the technology. It no longer becomes the only thing that we're thinking about, but rather it becomes the reason to look at the context around the technology itself. Openness. This is a principle of digital ethnography proposed by Pink et al. As we said, the digital is non-static, always changing, being updated, increasing in speed and transforming. It is processual, and there is no fixed method for investigating and understanding the digital. And so you have to be quite upfront and open about this, particularly when doing research for a private organization, a business, a company. You can focus on a thing, but that thing may change very quickly. So you need to move from making observations about experience and creating that data, and then using your theory and your analytical paradigm to help you generate a broader understanding of the experience that might be applicable in other situations. Pink et al. Says, digital ethnography can be shaped in relation to the particular research questions, which it asks, as well as to the institutional contexts which it is related to, and the ways in which participants in the research engage with it. This invites openness and allows for collaboration. We make knowledge with participants, not about them. It is the co-production of knowledge. And this was the message of the video, the lecture, the second part of the lecture at least, in week 4. So you can build up a community of collaborators to help you figure out how a particular brand is being understood via Instagram, or how likely someone is to click on the Shop Now button on Instagram or a Facebook ad or so on, with a team of a community of knowledge producers who are not part of your organization, but are part of community who are interested in your organization and doing research with you. Reflexive. This is really important, and this is the kind of key thing about ethnography, is the understanding of your own personal experience, your own personal history, your own personal culture, your own relationships with people and technologies, and how that frames your interpretation of experience. It is unique to you, but you need to register it and make sense of it in order to authentically engage in an ethnography. Ethnographic research knowledge is never objective. It is always formed through our own encounters and engagements with other people and things. Ethnographic research is interpretive. So it's not like quantitative data where you've got stats and you've got psychographics and so on. You're making informed observations by reflecting on that cultural framework and then making recommendations based on your subjective knowledge and experience. It's a very different type of research. Just as important, but it has its caveats. And one of those is it's not generalizable. It can help you to think about things, right? So when you are studying the way in which Twitch streamers talk about content online, right? That can help you figure out and think about the way in which Facebook live streamers are talking about content. But it's not generalizable, and it's not one-to-one. You can't say one is happening in one place and therefore it's happening in another. You have to evaluate each on their own, but that evaluation can be informed by your experience, so it's super valuable. Unorthodox. Digital ethnography is unpredictable and can go beyond traditional written forms of research. And this is where we're talking in this subject about the role of ethnography as content. Podcasts, streamers, Instagram presentation of the public self through the production of a persona. Ethnography is increasingly a content layer in the emergent media paradigm. It often lacks a high degree of reflexivity, but the very nature of the presentation of the public self as content in the online creative industries does include a kind of reflexivity. For example, seeing myself on the screen, right, is a very confronting thing. Listening to my voice on a podcast, because it sounds very different to how I sound, is a very confronting thing, and it helps us to constantly reevaluate how we are presenting ourselves. The other thing about digital ethnography is that it is unpredictable, and so it is crucial to take as many notes, as many screenshots, and record as much data as you can. This is because your research can go off in a completely different trajectory that you weren't expecting. And so it's important to map that trajectory out through your field site, right? Through your relations. That mapping of the field site, do that every week and come up with a different map or a different pathway through that map as you're collecting your data, because that will help you then communicate that experience via your DA. If you're doing a video essay, for example, or a blog post, those maps of the kind of process of collecting research will be immensely valuable and useful visual materials to help, as I say here, convey emotions, materialities, activities, and the configurations of the research process. Screenshot Record video like this. Sometimes just have a chat to yourself on your phone about your experience and collect as much of that data as you can, because the results are unpredictable. Okay, in the next part of this lecture, and I might cut it into two parts there. So if you're coming back to the second part, hi. In the second part, we're going to be applying these key principles to the 7 key themes or categories that Pink et al. Divide their book into. We're going to be thinking about digital ethnography and the research of experience, practices, things and objects, social worlds, relationships, localities, and events. So I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible, but there's a lot to go through here. So let's get into it. All right. How do we research experience of the digital? Pink et al. Says, researching the experience of the digital as an analytical concept is concerned with the relationship between the mind, the body, and the technology. Now, this is what we call a cybernetic relationship. Researching experience asks how the digital is embodied and lived through sensory modes of being. The senses permit the experience of things that are difficult or impossible to express through language, which cannot be observed directly. Here's a tip. Take a selfie of you sitting down doing your research. Think about your posture. Think about your relationship to the keyboard, to the mouse, your tablet, your phone, the screen. Think about where you're sitting. Think about the light. Think about the resolution of the screen. Think about the browser that you're using or the software that you're using to create your audio. How does that make you feel? Think about the relationship between your mind, the body, and technology, right? These are the kinds of things that are so mundane and so what we call ubiquitous, right? Or quotidian, right? Completely everyday things and experiences that most people overlook and don't register as being important, but they all form the basis for your experience. When you're collecting your data, at least once think about the cybernetic relationship between you and the device and you and the content that you're engaging with. More on that later. We'll unpack that a little bit more. So, how would you go about researching the sensory experience of playing games? Now, there's a whole bunch of different experiences here, connected to the senses. First, we have the mobile phone, where your hands are literally on the screen itself. Now, that creates important implications for design, important implications for the technologies that have to go into the production of the screen, whether you're using a screen protector. How does it feel? Do you like holding it up? How do you hold it up? There's a lot of talk about how people play mobile games on the toilet, right? Or brushing their teeth, or waiting for a coffee, or waiting in line, or waiting for a friend, right? These are all the different sensory experiences that play into this. How is that different to having your feet up on the table or sitting back on a couch and watching a screen that is across the room, right? What is the difference there in the sensory experience, and how does that play into the process of that leisure activity? Also, you've got the controller there, right? That is an entirely different relationship to the sense of touch. There's a different sense, even though they're both the screen, both the mobile and the console controller is about touch, they are entirely different types of touch. Look at the bottom two images. You've got two people, both at a PC, but you can see, one has their headset on the side and is not listening to the audio via the headset. Maybe they've got speakers. I don't know. The other has the headset on and is listening to the audio there. So there is a totally different sensory experience of consuming that culture or engaging in that leisure activity dependent on the way in which sound is working and hearing is working. And these are not things to ignore. These are really important questions to have because they help you develop knowledge about this experience that can then inform recommendations for designers, for advertisers, for different ways to market. All of this is really useful information. And so, one of the ways that we've been saying you develop this kind of approach is through participant observation, getting involved. One of the challenges of studying digital experience is that the experience is often difficult to articulate. This is why taking lots of notes and focusing on specific details is really useful. So you can help to build up layers of observations in order to clearly communicate this to an audience who might not have ever thought about these things. Participant observation attempts to understand and interpret experience, relying on the ethnographer's immersion in sights of other people's experiences. Right? How to make sense of what someone else's experience? Well, one of the ways to do that is start to have that experience for yourself. If you're not engaged in the area of research that you're doing, you're going to be at a distance. And so your data is going to be at a distance. And your recommendations and observations and findings and conclusions are going to be at a distance. Not necessarily valueless, but very different. Too often we lump the experience of play into one category, that of games. There are multiple modes of being through which we can understand the experience of play. Sound, vision, touch, but also multiple experiences. The way younger children play, for example, is very different to the way older children play, which is very different way to the way adults play. There's the notion of being playful as opposed to playing a game. And we can make sense of these differences by focusing on the different sensory elements involved in those play. What's involved in sound and communication, what's involved in the vision and the mediation, and how touch organizes the experience through what we call the haptics, the input of feedback, the input and feedback through material controllers. All right, let's move on because there's a lot to get through and I want to do this quickly. Researching practice. Okay. When we are doing a digital ethnography that is examining practice, we are being attentive to how actions and habits are shaped and maintained over time. So this is where that technology becomes decentered and we're focusing on the user themselves, right? Or the consumer or the participant. And we're focusing on their actions and their habits and how that's shaped over time. Pink et al. Says, practice-inflected ethnographies are particularly useful for capturing complex intersections between material, media, culture, and society. They bring the everyday and the invisible to the foreground. And this is where we're talking about, really focusing on the detail. So you're not just focusing on the thing itself, you're starting to build up an idea of how that thing works with yourself over time. So habits like, at what times during the day are you checking social media? At what times during the day are you checking email? At what time during the day are you watching content? How is your day organized? Not just through work practices or socialization practices or the movement of the sun, right, and the planet, but how your actions and habits have accumulated. Have you ever tried to break a habit with regards to the practices of social media, right? Or messaging? How difficult has that been, right? We don't often think about this. Another thing we don't often think about is our relationship to our technologies, and we'll talk more about this over time in a second when we talk about things, but I'm focusing now specifically on the practice, right? I'm quite interested in the ways in which people add stickers to laptops and tablets and things like that. I'm also interested in the way in which people might change phone cases or you have ornamentation on their phone cases in order to personalize, right? And engage with that object. Researching practice requires different analytical frameworks. For example, in The Practice of Everyday Life, a book by Michel Decentred, the author explores the individualization of mass-produced objects and popular culture. Decentred is drawing on another sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu to consider how the practice of using objects like cutlery, stationery, or streets, and the rituals, how we view them, the pathways that we take across them, the laws that we make about them, make these objects and practices our own. And so I'm going to, there's a section from The Practice of Everyday Life on the Moodle readings this week, and you will see as you're reading through it, the analytical framework that's being constructed through the concept of practice, the concept of objects, and the concept of rituals, and how that framework is shaping the analysis of the experience of the data. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get you to do in your digital artifacts. So one way to apply this is to think about workplace practices. One of the disciplines that has evolved to think about this is known as cultural studies, which has examined the possibility for resistance in the consumption of everyday products, services, platforms, and media, right? This is complicating the notion of consumption, that it's not just a kind of blind, slavish, unthinking consumption, but rather that people are actively engaged every day in the critical practice of consumption, particularly when it comes to products and services and platforms. So cultural studies develops its own analytical framework that through which we understand meaning making as the symbolic resistance that is mobilized by the working class, feminism, indigenous audiences, and what have previously called the subaltern. I'll link to this on the Moodle site, but this is a really interesting article that uses this kind of approach to critically evaluate the culture of sexism at the company called Riot Games. So I'll link that on the Moodle site as well. So another way to approach this notion of practice is to reevaluate the paradigm. And a famous approach to do this is to think about the relationship between what we call technological determinism versus the social shaping, right? So this is a really interesting argument when we think about games and addiction, right? So the technologically determinist approach would be to say that games are designed to be addictive, particularly games where you have to pay a lot of money, you have microtransactions and things like that, right? They're actually actively designed to trigger the psychology of the human brain and make you pay more money or do more of the thing in order to participate. Now, there may be some truth to that. However, the alternative approach is the idea of what we call social shaping, which recognizes that humans have a very high degree of agency. And when a technology or a text or a practice comes into our lives or starts to be formed, we are actively having agency over that. And we do have the capacity to shape that technology to our existence. For example, maybe we have a level of disposable income and maybe we enjoy playing that game. And so we are playing that game a lot and we're spending a lot of money because we're getting something out of that. Now, the point at which that becomes addiction, that's in the point of tension between these two viewpoints. And you can research that, right, through digital ethnography. So a good example of this is, of course, the mobile game Hearthstone. Connected to this idea is Nick Coldry's approach that argues that we shouldn't be thinking about media and particularly digital technologies and so on as kind of products or productions, but rather ongoing practices. That nothing is fixed, nothing is static. The individual is always changing, always able to go, actually, maybe I am playing this too much and step back, or maybe I'm no longer getting what I was getting out of this and moving on to the next thing. And he argues that, audiences are not abstract. They're not interchangeable. They're unique, they're complex, and they're entangled. And that, media ethnography is a really useful way to get into this and to figure out the specifics of what's going on rather than making just blanket generalizations that you might see, say, in a news media story. All right, so this is now connected. So you can see how all these categories are overlapped. So, you might be looking at the relationship between things and doing a digital ethnography about things, but also connecting that to researching practice, right? So I say this a lot, and you will have heard me say this a lot, particularly in the tutes. Right? Too often we ignore the material, the specifics, the present qualities of the individual objects that we consider to be digital. Right? The digital always has a material. Right? Whenever you're in a location, you're connecting to the Wi-Fi, you're actually connecting to a fixed Wi-Fi point that is somewhere in the room or in the corridor or in the ceiling or somewhere near you. You're connecting to a physical point. Right? And this is why it's important not to underestimate the material and the present quality of digital objects. Things, says Silverstone and Hirsch, must be viewed as material objects, capable, yes, of great symbolic significance, inviting investment, helping to produce meaning. And Silverstone and Hirsch, who are quoted in Pink et al., are particularly interested in the domestic technologies that are particularly important. So how do we apply this? Well, one of the ways you could do this is to think about researching a game console like the Nintendo Switch. There are kind of two different ways to go about this. You could think about researching your relationship to the Switch, where you store it, how you charge it, how you play. Are you using the side controllers or are you using a remote like Pro controller? How are you storing it? Where are you taking it? What locations are you bringing it into? How is it structuring your day? How important is the object? Do you take care of it? Is it a precious object or does it get bashed about in your bag, right? That's one way to think about the thingness of the Nintendo Switch. Another way, and you see this again, right? Ethnography as content, you see teardown videos on YouTube. There were lots of these when it came out. So people were actively pulling apart the Switch to figure out the technologies that are going in here, right? To look at the quality of the battery, to look at the quality of the capacitors, to look at the quality of the insulation, the screws, the wiring of the chips, the soldering of the connections, and actually really deep level analysis of the material technological elements of the Switch in order to make sense of it for their lives. Very interesting approach. Now, again, this has already been done extensively in cultural studies, and this was one of my favorite books as an undergrad. Yeah, I know I'm showing how old I am there, but I don't care, right? This was a fantastic book by Duguay and Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall is one of my favorite cultural studies writers. And they produced this book doing cultural studies, the story of the Sony Walkman. So they applied all of this stuff. A Walkman, right? Okay, gosh, it was like an iPod. You're not even going to know what that is. It's like your phone, but all it did was play music, and it used things called plastic magnetic tapes. You know what I mean. I'm just being silly. But you get the point, right? It's this ancient technology for listening to music in the everyday. This is a great review of this book. I'll link this on the Moodle page, but it's worth just highlighting these points here. The aim was to understand the social dynamics related to the Walkman. So it wasn't about the technical thing, right, with the Switch, but rather what I was saying in the first instance, the kind of social dynamics associated with the the Walkman. They were interested in 5 basic and interlinked dimensions: the way in which the Walkman was represented, right? Represented in people's photographs, represented in marketing and advertising, and so on. The way in which the Walkman produced identity, right? This is connected to mixtapes. This is connected to the idea of listening to the radio on the Walkman or listening to a tape as you're walking through the city compared to when doing a jog or using it to study to, and so on, right? The connection between the technology and your identity. The production of the Walkman, where it was produced in the world, and how it was shipped, and how it was boxed, and how it was, and then that is connected to how it was consumed. In what way was it purchased? How long did that purchase last? Connected to batteries, and so on and so on. Connected to the quality of the audio, and so on. And how the Walkman was regulated via government, via taxation, via copyrights, and so on and so on. The book's conclusion is that culture can be studied not only as a series of contents or as connected set of. The book's conclusion is that culture can be studied not only as a series of contents or as a connected set of manufactured devices, but also as an ensemble of practices embedded into modes of production and ways of consuming. Okay, social worlds. Right now, we're really starting to get away from the technology itself. We're going in a different direction to thingness. And we're thinking about the social worlds, the sociality that digital technologies enable and form. The digital, the online, and the virtual have transformed what we think of as social worlds. Platforms which have enabled individuals to have social interactions synchronously and asynchronously. Synchronously means in real-time chat, and asynchronously means something more like email, where you get a send and response. But sometimes these collapse via, DMs, for example. Sometimes when you're both on your, or maybe messages, and you're both in the right space at the right time, you can converse one-to-one. But then sometimes that becomes asynchronous, and someone will send you a message, and then after work you check in, or at lunchtime or whatever, you check in and you respond, and so that conversation gets stretched out over time. These distinctions matter. Online social worlds can be textual, they can be 2D, they can be 3D, they can be representations of place, they can be platforms like Discord, they can be inhabited by one or two people, or they can be they can have multiple simultaneous participants. Digital social worlds include the use of text messaging, direct messaging, emojis, email, social networking, memes, GIFs, and so on. So, for example, you could examine the social worlds of different games. On the left, you've got League of Legends, MOBA players, right? Very different experience to Overwatch and the experience of FPS players. You could just dump this and say, oh, this is just online games. But the truth is that the social worlds, right? I'm not talking about the experience of play in this instance. That's just an example on the screen. But I'm talking about the broader culture, right? The Discord chats for communities playing League of Legends are very different to the Discord chats of people playing FPS players. The social world of console gamers is very different to the social world of PC gamers, even though they might have similar platforms. A great book on this notion was Bellerstorff et al. These are all famous virtual ethnographers or digital ethnographers. Really, really interesting book in which they challenge the notion of the real. Now, this is really important. So this distinction that virtual worlds or social networking or whatever is not real is complete garbage, right? We've seen in England, we've seen a teenager arrested for posting, kind of violent themed rap lyrics over the top of images on Instagram. Arrested, right? For hate speech. We've seen a young man in the US arrested by the FBI for trash talking in League of Legends, saying that he was going to go and shoot up his school. Right? Just a kid losing his mind over losing, not thinking about what he's saying, having a very real world consequence. Right? Even if he was planning to or not, right, has a very real world consequence. So the notion that the online is not real, it no longer makes any sense. And that's what these guys were arguing. Okay, connected to the study of social worlds is, you might have heard the term ethnography. the internet and ethnography. This was the kind of approach back in 2010 by Kozinets, which was the study of communities as having both online and offline elements. I think the collapse is much stronger than what it was 10 years ago. But, Kozinets still use this term to refer to a group of people who share social interactions, social ties, and a common interactional format along a continuum of participation. So some people can participate more than others, right? But it exists both online and offline. You see this a lot in, say, disability support communities, local disability support communities, say communities of people with young children with autism. You'll see they have local Facebook groups, and they will also have offline events where they meet up. So this is a continuum of participation. Some people are really active, some people are not, but it is an important social world that has formed, and the process of netnography is one specific methodology for thinking about that. Oh, cheeky link here to the UOW Digital Media Society. The Digital Media Society is for all students in the university, not just students in the digital and social media major, and not just for students in the BCM. It's all about, and this is from their website, memes, networking, and mentoring. It's a great society. It is a great social world that students can be part of. You're already part of it because you're in the Discord server for the tutorials that is run by the society. So check out that link and sign up. Okay. Researching social worlds is implying multiple people. Researching relationships is tending to start narrowing that focus. Not always, because there's relationships in social worlds, but the emphasis tends to be on, say, familial units, one-to-one relationships, but also relationships between, fans and the texts of their fandom, or the companies that own those texts, and so on. So there's a real, again, quite a varied notion of what relationship means. So the question is, initially, how has the digital changed the way we form and maintain, even end relationships? But increasingly, it's not so much about how the digital has changed, but rather how the digital is fundamentally part of relationships. How has the digital changed relations between people and things? Now, don't get me wrong here, right? One of the reasons why board games are so popular, one of the reasons why vinyl records are so popular, one of the reasons why material objects are so popular is because the digital and the internet has made them easier to access, easier to buy, easier to understand, and easier to discuss, easier to show off collections, and so on, right? So the digital has changed the relationship that people have to physical materials and products. So an example of the way in which digital has changed relationships is the way in which fandom has changed over time. Expressions of fandom, such as cosplay, have provided a unique way to understand the changing relationship between producers and consumers, and between participants in networks that were previously considered as groups. So what I'm trying to get at here is that you can see the way in which cosplay has changed over time. The notion of costume play, for example, has actually become an entire industry, right? Whereas in its early days, it was kind of an affectionate display of identity. That has been industrialized, and you get really fascinating groups like Camus Cosplay, which is a husband and wife team who have a YouTube channel. They sell books on how to create cosplay. They have this Instagram. They do public appearances. They do public workshops. So the paratextual relationship between the individual and the cosplay is no longer just an expression of fandom, but has become a participatory industry in and of itself. And so the notion of the way in which the relationship has changed there is really profound and really interesting. So one of the books that was really useful in contributing to changing the way we think about relationships in the digital era was the book Networked by Lee Rainie and Barry Wellman. And they argue that the impact of the digital is not, again, right, this notion between online and off, but rather a continuum of what they call hyperconnected life. Back in the early days of the internet in the late 1990s and 2000, we often talked about the digital divide, about people that don't have access to mobile phones and the internet, and that has shrunk year on year on year. Now, there are still people that struggle to afford an internet connection, struggle to afford the phones and PCs and things like that, right? There's also people who struggle with literacy and really making sense of the digital. So the digital divide still exists. But even those people are by their absences scooped up into this massive continuum of what it means to be kind of living a hyperconnected life. Networked individualism helps to describe how people have changed the ways they interact and become increasingly networked as individuals rather than being embedded in groups. And that's often a critique of a kind of negative critique of social media, is that it has hyper intensified the individual. And so now the individual is the primary way through which we understand contemporary life and society. That we no longer think about communities or nations and states, but we focus more on the individual. And Rainie and Wellman's response to that, well, actually, possibly, but it's networks of individuals. So it's actually the communities magnified enormously because we are all part of a whole range of particular cultural groups, networks, interactions that have their own cultures and their own politics. And so really, yes, the individual became massively important, but we've created this entire new layering of networking relationships that have replaced older ways of thinking in terms of familiar relationships, in terms of social relationships, and kind of cultural identity. All right, we're getting towards the end here, so bear with me, we're nearly there. Okay, another way to engage in digital ethnography is to think about locality. Remember, we were talking about location and place and objects in time and space, right? Being is important when it comes to the digital, and we are beings in specific localities, whether it's your lounge room, your study, the bus, the library, the classroom, wherever it is, right? There is a locality that is implied in that experience. So digital technologies are increasingly part of the same processes through which localities are produced, experienced, and defined. If you've ever used Google Maps, if you've ever looked up Google Earth, if you've ever used a phone, right? Your phone is constantly surveilling you. It is telling the telecommunication company where you are with precise details, and that information can be used by social networking companies, that can be used by advertising companies, it can be used by the government, by the police, right? Localities are entirely embedded in every single digital action. Like whenever you take a digital photo, right, the metadata, the EXIF data will often, if it's on a phone with a GPS, will often have a GPS location embedded in that image. You cannot escape the physical. Localities can be constituted through the online-offline dimensions that are used to experience them. Certain physical digital related sites can be explored as forms of digital material locality. For example, you can explore a particular latitude and longitude on the planet by putting that into a Google search and finding photos that have that in their metadata. Right? That's the kind of connection that's being implied here. We talked earlier about the different location for playing games, but there's also a different experience connected to the geography, right? There's a very different experience of playing online games in an Australian home compared to a Korean or a Chinese LAN cafe, for example. And we talked a little bit about this before, right? But how often do you think about a location in terms of the quality of its Wi-Fi? I had students last session who were driving to Macca's to sit in the car park and use their Wi-Fi to get on Discord because their home NBN connection was really poor and they couldn't get a connection, right? So how much of your daily life is structured by the presence of a Wi-Fi signal or a mobile signal? How much of your day is actually structured by the presence of those signals, and how is your location determined by those signals? And again, there's a whole range now of different games, different apps that have a kind of location built into them, and we're going to see much more of this in the future as these kinds of technologies take off. All right. I think this is the last one, events, right? So events have enormously changed with the rise of digital technologies. And I think, the current pandemic is a very interesting example of that, particularly as we were asked to lock down and isolate. This global event became something that was entirely constituted by digital information. Everything that we knew about number of cases, the location of the cases, all the health recommendations, right? All the information about what to do. This was a massive global event that we all consumed via the internet and via digital technologies. Pink says, think of an event as a happening in which a series of things and processes of possibly different qualities and affordances come together and might subsequently then disperse. So an event is something that happens in time. It can be a very small event, a very long event, a very short event. It can be a mundane event. It is possible to understand both mundane and spectacular happenings as a form of event. So while you might call the global pandemic quite spectacular, you can focus on more specific events that happened as a part of that larger process. I'm going to try and put an excerpt from Doreen Massey's book on First Space, which is a really interesting way of thinking about events as what she calls a constellation of processes, and how the digital has exponentially expanded the extent of these constellations. Quite an interesting book, that one. And, I guess in a post-COVID world, we're not going to see these kinds of events anymore. But I wanted to put the Dota 2 esports tournament in as an example of an event that was happening online and off. And I guess you can put something like the Eurovision contest as well here, right? Something that is asynchronously occurring online and off. And so that has a kind of enormous potential. The Olympic Games, are another one of these global events that constitute this this collapse between the distinction between the online and off. All right, that was a whirlwind tour of digital ethnography. I hope some of that was useful, particularly for you thinking about your own media ethnographies. For example, one of the ways in which you could focus on your own media ethnography is to think about a particular event that has happened in your media niche. Or another way to go about it would be to think about the types of relationships that are formed around your media niche and how that informs how you might understand it. Another way to go would be to think about the material elements and the things that are embedded in your media niche. And I'd highly recommend, spending a little time in your digital artifacts, thinking about the 7 key themes in some way, and thinking about the connections between them too. All right, that's it from me this week. Thanks for watching, and happy researching.